George Harrison is remembered as the quiet, gentle Beatle, the spiritual one, the last person anyone would imagine carrying bitterness. But the truth of his life reveals wounds far deeper than the public ever saw. Born on the 25th of February 1943, in a tiny, freezing two-up, two-down house on Arnold Grove, George grew up in poverty, but inside the drafty walls lived a mother who unknowingly shaped his destiny by playing Radio India during her pregnancy, filling the air with sitars and tablas that later seemed to live in George's bones. As a boy, he drew guitars in the edges of his schoolbooks and felt trapped in a school system that had no place for dreamers. Everything changed the day he heard Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel drift from a neighbor's window. An explosion in his young mind that pushed him to beg for a cheap guitar until his mother sacrificed £3 to buy one. George practiced until his fingers bled, formed a skiffle group called the Rebels, and then met Paul McCartney on a school bus, two teenagers bonding over chords before Paul introduced him to John Lennon. Lennon initially dismissed George for looking too young, but after hearing him play in the dim light of a bus top deck, John silently accepted him into the Quarrymen, a decision that would lead three Liverpool boys into unimaginable fame and eventually unspoken resentment. By the mid-1960s, when the Beatles were the biggest band on Earth, George's growing creativity collided with John Lennon's indifference. John brushed off George's early compositions with comments like, "It's nothing," and mocked his new devotion to meditation and Indian philosophy. The humiliation reached its peak during the Let It Be sessions, where footage later revealed George repeatedly ignored or spoken over until he finally muttered his famous line, "I'll play whatever you want, or I won't play at all." A breaking point that exposed years of swallowed frustration. Yet, the deepest hurt didn't come from John, it came from Paul McCartney. As Paul increasingly tightened his grip on the Beatles' sound, George felt suffocated, unseen, and micromanaged. Paul frequently stood over him in the studio, dictating guitar parts and rejecting songs George had spent months writing. Years later, George admitted the truth aloud only once. "Paul ruined me as a guitarist," meaning emotionally, not technically. Their coldest conflict emerged in January 1969, when George confronted Paul about constantly overriding him, only for Paul to reply, "I'm trying to help you, George," prompting George to fire back, "You don't listen to anyone else." That single sentence reflected years of tension he rarely dared to voice. Even after the breakup, the resentment lingered. In 1987, George said plainly that he'd join a band with John again, but not Paul, insisting it was musical, not personal, though everyone knew it was both. As the years passed, George quietly battled. Cancer first his throat, then his lung, then his brain fighting through pain while recording what would become his final album, Brainwashed. Too weak to sing full melodies, he whispered ideas into a recorder, determined to finish the music before time ran out. In his final days in November 2001, surrounded by Olivia and Donnie, devotional chants filled the room as he drifted in and out of consciousness. Friends like Tom Petty and Paul McCartney said their emotional goodbyes, and George passed on the 29th of November 2001, with his family reciting the Bhagavad Gita beside him. His ashes were quietly taken to India and released into the Ganges and Yamuna rivers, exactly as he had always wished. Today, his legacy, "Here comes the sun, while my guitar gently weeps. All things must pass," and his pioneering charity work reveals a man who suffered in silence, yet transformed pain into timeless beauty. His life shows that even the quietest one in the room can carry the heaviest burdens, and sometimes forgiveness is the hardest song to write.